Karina Gould, thanks for dropping by.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
Uh, First question is, why are you running for the leadership of the Liberal Party of Canada?
Hmm. I am running for the leadership of the Liberal Party of Canada because I care so much about this country and about Canadians. And right now, we need somebody who has the political experience to defend Canada from the threats from south of the border, but also to win the next election. And I am the person that is capable of doing that. And I have a positive, progressive vision for this country that is going to lift people up and grow our economy. And I want Canada to be ambitious and to make sure that we protect what is important here and our values and to stand up for Canadians.
Okay. First question was a bit of a layup. This one might be a little tougher. Um, the next leader of the party has to hit the ground running. There's going into an election just almost immediately after. And by any measure, polling, financing, the public conversation, it's looking like Mark Carney's got this thing sewn up. Shouldn't people just let him become the next leader?
Well, that's not very democratic, Paul, is it? Look, I mean, I have to say that I am having a wonderful experience and am so encouraged by the momentum and the growing support that I'm getting across the country from where I started 5 weeks ago. You know, I have the second most amount of donors. I have support across this country, and momentum just keeps building. And people are excited and they are turning their attention. They like what I'm saying. And I think that's really important. And, you have been a longtime student of politics, of elections, and you know as well as I do that sometimes where you start a race is not where you finish it. And polls are a snapshot in time. But to see momentum grow and support grow, we've got 2.5 weeks left in this campaign. We've got some key moments coming up, and I'm excited to keep building that support and keep building that momentum.
Now, you're 37 years old.
Hmm.
I'm not, I'm the guy who knows that that doesn't make you the youngest leadership candidate in the history of the country, or even in relatively recent history. In 1976, just yesterday, two guys named Joe Clark and Brian Mulroney ran for the Progressive Conservative leadership. They were both 37. One became the leader immediately. The other became the next leader. And a lot of people have been wondering whether that's your play. Are you setting yourself up for greater prominence in the party down the line?
Oh, well, that's an auspicious fact that I didn't know about, Paul. So I'm glad I now know that. Look, I'm in it to win it. And I'm in it to make sure that we have a robust debate. And my promise is that I'm here today, tomorrow, and for years to come. Look, I've been a liberal since I was 14 years old. I care deeply about this party because it's been my vehicle my entire life to contribute to Canada and to make Canada better. So I hope to win this time around, but certainly, I am committed to the party for the long term and I'm committed to Canada for the long term.
What's the race about?
Well, the race, I think, is about two things. I think it's about who we are as liberals, and it's about what our vision is for Canada. Obviously, Trump and the threats from south of the border have sharpened the mind, not just for liberals, but I think for a lot of Canadians as to who it is that we are and what we stand for. And I think what we're seeing is that when Canadians have to make a choice, and we're seeing this, in polling, but also when what I'm talking to Canadians about across the country is that they want to have the party that has traditionally stood up and fought for Canada and fought for Canadians. And they don't want to see, someone who is following Trump's playbook and who has been using a lot of the same rhetoric, a lot of the same ideas in Pierre Poilievre, going up against Trump because they don't have the confidence that he would actually stand up and defend Canada when he is so similar in his pursuits here in Canada.
Does the U.S. administration have a point when they express concern about fentanyl crossing the Canada-U.S. border and about migrants crossing the border?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to say that it's nothing, but it's not the same scale on which the U.S. administration is suggesting that it is. But what I would say is that certainly fentanyl and the opioid crisis have been devastating here in Canada. And so while, for the past decade, there have been a lot of efforts made, I think we can do a lot more to support Canadians, support communities, and to crack down on fentanyl in Canada. Um, so I think that's something where we should be able to work together with the Americans because it should be a shared objective to rid our society of fentanyl. On migrants, however, I mean, like, let's be honest, we probably have more people coming from south of the border into Canada than we have going the other way around. So, it's one of the reasons why, as a government, we renegotiated the Safe Third Country Agreement. And I think we need to have an honest conversation with Americans and with Canadians about that. But, strengthening our border is a good thing. But it's not really the main thing, I think, when it comes to the U.S.-Canada relationship in terms of what the U.S. is talking about in terms of real facts and numbers.
Okay. Given the facts on the ground that you describe, and I'm going to be honest, this is a question I sort of puzzle over myself. Say you or I had been the prime minister in the last week of November instead of Justin Trudeau. Should that prime minister have gone down to Mar-a-Lago and started bargaining? The tariff threat comes on the Monday. On the Friday, the prime minister and half the cabinet are at that table at Mar-a-Lago.
I think there
I
was
think
only
on,
one
on, on
cabinet
balance,
minister
I'll,
with him,
I'll
but
give you my
yeah,
answer.
yeah,
On balance, I think it was probably more worth trying than not,
yeah.
but it sure doesn't seem to have helped.
Well, I don't know about that, Paul, because I mean, in terms of what the government then put in the fall economic statement in terms of the border measures, so the threat from President Trump continued, but the outcome was essentially what was already agreed to in the fall economic statement. So I do think that it was probably a very helpful conversation in understanding what it was that the president was after. We know President Trump's style is to kind of go to the furthest possible point and then come back. I mean, we saw that in the negotiation of NAFTA. We saw that with the original steel and aluminum tariffs. So I think we have a pretty good understanding of his approach and how he negotiates. And so I think the fact that the Prime Minister and Minister LeBlanc and I think Katie Telford went down there. They were able to glean, what it was that the Americans wanted. We put that in the fall economic statement, and then that's essentially what was agreed to when the 30-day reprieve on tariffs was put in place.
What happens next? I mean, it looks like there's just a full court press to keep President Trump from implementing the tariffs that he keeps threatening. But over the long term, the threats themselves become the problem.
Mm.
They discourage any
Sure.
potential investor from setting up shop on Canadian soil. I'm sure that's precisely the point of the threats. And how can you keep a guy from flapping his jaw? Like how can you keep those threats from recurring?
Well, I think it's an excellent question, and it's obviously the objective to have them removed from the table entirely, right? Because otherwise, it's going to be a very difficult 4 years. But from my perspective, it's about making sure that we are continually building and tending to the relationship with the United States, and not just with the president, but with industry, with Congress people, but also with everyday Americans. So it's explaining and sharing with Americans why the relationship with Canada is so important. I personally, when I become prime minister, I think we need to have a real charm offensive in the US and an advertising campaign with everyday Americans that explains why the relationship with Canada is important, what the history has been, but also what it would mean today if those tariffs are imposed. Like, if we think about the auto industry, that could shut down the big three in a matter of days. If we think about auto parts going into the US, like, the US doesn't produce their own auto parts right now. They rely on Canada and on Mexico. If those parts are not circulating in the United States, that could um, set the entire delivery system. So Amazon, FedEx, USPS, UPS, like their fleets would stop running in 30 days. Like there is real tangible consequences to these tariffs for everyday Americans. It's not just about prices going up at the grocery store, but it's also because our economies are so intertwined that things will actually change in their day to day. So I think it's important for us as Canadians to demonstrate that to everyday Americans and to make it very clear that this isn't something that we want, but these are the consequences if they happen and the impact that they'll have on everyday Americans. Because the president ultimately he wants to be popular with Americans and he wants them to think that he's going to be able to deliver on those prices going down at the grocery store or at the pump. But what he's doing will only make them go up. And so I think we need to be very clear with Americans that, this is the consequence of picking a fight with Canada, or we can do things together and we can actually solve some of the challenges that they're facing in the United States as partners as opposed to foes.
You're a small number of days away from the first official debates of this leadership cycle. Let me help you rehearse. How does that approach differ from the approach that Chrystia Freeland or Mark Carney are taking?
Well, it might not differ that much, Paul, because at the end of the day, we're all liberals and we all have the best interest of Canadians at heart. What I think is important is that right now, we shouldn't be freelancing in terms of our approach to the United States because I think we need to have a united approach as Canada. And any fissure in that will only be exploited by the Americans. So, I'm not sure that you're going to get major differences from the three main candidates here because hopefully at the end of the day, we're all going to be working together as well on Team Canada to defend our country.
I caught myself short 5 minutes ago when you said that when I'm prime minister, I'm going to do this. I was surprised when you announced your candidacy. A lot of people who had been in the conversation, Melanie Joly and Dominic LeBlanc and Francois-Philippe Champagne, decided not to go. Yours was a new name in this context. Did you know 6 months ago that if the job came open, you would go for it?
No. No, I decided to do this on January 9th. So the Prime Minister resigned January 6th, and I made the decision to enter the race on January 9th. And I am not someone who works behind somebody's back. I have always been loyal and respectful. And it was only when it became clear that the Prime Minister was going to be resigning that I started to think about this seriously. And it was over the holidays that people started to reach out to me and ask if I would consider doing this. And I only made the decision to do it on January 9th.
Whose opinion carried the most weight?
Oh, probably my husband, because everybody else, they don't have to live with me while I do this. So there were colleagues, there were former staff, there were former colleagues that asked if I would consider doing this, and that said that they would support me. So it was a chorus of folks that gave me the final push to do it. But if my husband hadn't have said that he would be supportive and on board, I probably wouldn't have done it.
Now, people have seen a lot more of you recently as House Leader. They've been getting to know you as a figure in this government. But the first time I noticed you as minister was what had to have been a difficult day. As 8 years ago this month, as Minister of Democratic Reform, you came out and said that the government would not be going ahead um, with a change to the voting system. Um, and what I've always thought is uh, that had to suck because that was Justin Trudeau's campaign promise. He made the promise and he got to live in fancy houses for the rest of his career. You're the one who came out and said that the government wouldn't be implementing the promise. That seems a little asymmetrical in terms of who gets to have the good day.
Um, Yeah, I mean, sometimes you have to do things that suck in politics. And that was definitely a hard day, but I learned so much from it. And I learned so much about how to get things done. in politics as well. I think one of the big lessons for me when it comes to how we approached electoral reform before became the minister was that we were kind of naive about it. We thought that we could create this parliamentary committee and everybody would agree on what the best system was. There'd be a consensus and everyone would get along because we would all know that that was the right thing to do. And actually, that's not how partisan politics work. And it's not how parliamentary committees tend to work. And especially when it comes to something as fundamental as choosing how we vote, the only two things that the committee agreed on were that we should have no mandatory voting and no electronic voting. Everything else they disagreed on. So I think that was a very important lesson for me as somebody who was more new to politics at that time about how to get things done and what was something that was, perhaps an idealistic approach versus a real approach. So I definitely learned a lot. It's not something that I want to have to do again, but certainly you know, live to tell the tale.
And for the record, in your campaign material and in your plans for the next several years in Canadian public life, you're not anticipating a change to the electoral system?
So, what I am going to agree to is if there is an interest to put together a citizens' assembly. I have no intellectual argument against that. There continues to be, a movement in Canada that wants to see change to our electoral system. I don't think we can do it through Parliament. And I don't think a government can unilaterally do it. So I think that having a citizens' assembly is the right approach to get citizens to study it, to come up with something. And then if they do come up with a plan, then I would put that to a referendum because I don't think that we can change how we vote without the buy-in of the majority of Canadians. So I'm not going to say this is the system that we need to have and, say that, getting elected to a majority government is sufficient for that. I think that this is something that if we want electoral reform in Canada, needs to be developed and done and decided by our citizens.
Are there other major government initiatives of the last decade that you would cancel, roll back, make big changes in? I mean, on the day that you announced that you were going to get into the race, not because you were announcing that you get in the race, just for other reasons, your party was terribly behind in the polls and almost certain to really eat dirt in the next election. How did it get there?
Well, as I said on my launch, I think we lost the trust of Canadians. And I think we needed to re-earn it back. And part of that is that, and I can pinpoint the moment that that started to change. And it was, at the end of the pandemic when inflation was starting to get out of control. Um, as a government, and I say this collectively, like I don't lay the blame at anybody's feet. I think it was the government as a whole. Um, we were very focused on how well we had handled COVID. And I think, Canadians tend to agree that as a government, we handled the pandemic really well. It was hard, but we handled it well, and Canada came out better than many other countries around the world. And we were not listening to what Canadians were telling us in that moment. And in that moment, people were like, whoa, yeah, it's great that you handled the public health crisis well. It's great that we got through this economically, but inflation is skyrocketing. My groceries are, way more expensive than I've ever had. My mortgage rate in some cases has just doubled. My rent is skyrocketing. And we were like, but look how good of a job we did on the pandemic. And one of the things that I've often said to colleagues in Ottawa is that remember, Winston Churchill won the war and then he lost the election because elections are about the future. They're about the now and the future. And, eventually we got there when it came to cost of living and we did some big things on housing. We did the grocery rebate. But in those kind of 6 to 8 months, Canadians were saying, like, hey, we're talking to you, we're telling you what's wrong, and you're not listening to us and you're not acknowledging where we are. And I think, that moment really kind of broke trust with Canadians. And so for me, It's really important, and I've always been a grassroots politician to say we need to listen to what people are telling us right now, and we need to understand where they're coming from. And I think part of that was, the pandemic took us away from Canadians in a way because we were virtual, we weren't necessarily with them on the ground. And then it took us a while to get back into that. And I think we have to acknowledge, the good things that we've done, but also acknowledge where we made mistakes and where we need to do better. And for me, that's one of the key points.
Um, the one of your colleagues, the health minister, or actually the deputy minister of health, had uh, a team of academics look into COVID science and deliver a report. The government has never responded to that expert report on COVID science. Um, I can almost guarantee there's going to be more pandemics in the future. Has the government been too eager to get past a spot of bad news and not eager enough to apply some lessons?
Yeah. So I haven't read that report, so I can't comment specifically on it. But you know, it's very common as governments to get through a crisis and then to try to get back to normal, as opposed to necessarily doing the the big debrief because you're busy responding to the next issue that's coming up. But I think as Canada, we have to make sure that we are learning the lessons from the pandemic. We're learning the lessons both in terms of the public health response, but also the economic response. And we're absorbing those and accepting them and applying them for the future. So I can't comment specifically on that, but one thing that I think we all kind of see over time is that you get through a major crisis, there are lessons to be learned, but there's already new issues on the docket. And so you don't necessarily take the time to apply those lessons because you're busy catching up to the next thing, which I'm
Okay.
not saying is the right approach. So.
One of the things that you are specific about on your website is that you call for a pause in the consumer carbon tax. First of all, how long would the pause be?
Oh, I'd cancel it. I'd cancel the increase,
Okay.
right? So there's an increase scheduled for April 1st, and I would just cancel that. I would say we're not increasing it.
Then or ever after?
Well, we can have a conversation about if there's an ever after, but at this point in time, it's a permanent cancellation of the increase.
Okay. So
Mhm.
the consumer carbon tax stays in place at the current rate.
Correct. And the reason for that, Paul, is that
Mhm.
um, when people are upset about the carbon tax, they're not saying they don't care about fighting climate change or they don't care about the environment. What they're saying is that we are in a cost of living crisis and they can't afford for things to get more expensive. And the Conservatives have done a really effective job of linking the price on pollution to the cost of living, even though we know that that's not actually one of the things that is contributing. Inflation is the primary factor there, and inflation, even though it's back down to, within the target range, the increase has been baked in to costs, right? So, I think we just have to have an honest conversation with Canadians about the price on pollution. I'm not prepared to abandon the fight on climate change. We know that the price on pollution, the consumer price, is responsible for 10 to 15% of our emissions reductions. And if we're going to replace it, we need to speak honestly with Canadians about what that looks like. And when I hear people say, well, just, jack up the industrial price, well, you can only do that so much, right? Like you can't make up the industrial price for the consumer price. It's not a one-to-one ratio. And it will also have an impact on our industry as well. So what I would like to do is say, let's give Canadians options in terms of how they reduce their emissions and make life more affordable. So I want to bring back and increase the rebate for electric vehicles and hybrids, and I want to include gas hybrids in that as well. Like I just got back from Alberta and Saskatchewan and drove between Edmonton and Saskatoon. There are not so many charging stations along the way there, but you know what? A gas hybrid would reduce your emissions and save you money at the pump. And that might be a good stepping stone for folks, on the path to lower emissions vehicles. And the other thing, like I was just in the prairies, it was minus 30 for the 4 days that I was there. It was cold. And so how do we help people refurbish their homes so that their energy bills are reduced. That like these are things that Canadians want to make these decisions, both for environmental reasons, but also for cost of living reasons. And so, as a government, we can actually help Canadians make the choices that they want to make and reduce their bills at the end of the day. So, for me, it's about having an honest conversation with Canadians about how we reduce our emissions, but also how we help people make life more affordable with like real practical ways of doing that.
That's a pretty good conversation about the trade-offs. And as a matter of fact, it's more elaborate than most of what I heard from this government over the last half decade on these issues. But by comparison with the other candidates, because they're all running away from the carbon tax as fast as they can, you're left as the relative champion of the consumer carbon tax among the Liberals. First of all, has Pierre Poilievre called you carbon tax Karina? And
Uh,
secondly, is how can you defend this in an election?
well, I don't know if he has called me that. I call him Timbit Trump. Um, so maybe in the current context, that's actually more apt. And I think what Canadians care about even more right now is defending ourselves against Trump. But I think, again, we'd have to be honest with Canadians. I mean, one of the things that frustrated me over the past decade is that we never really told the story. And we talked about the price on pollution and the checks as an affordability measure. And we didn't talk about, well, why are we doing this and what are the results and how did it end up the way that it was? Because originally, it was supposed to be provinces and territories putting on their own consumer price, and they could choose the system in which they would do that. And then we had a bunch of provinces who said that they weren't going to do it, and that's where the federal backstop came into place. And as a government, we said, well, we're not going to collect this revenue and send it back to these provinces that are then going to use it to build roads or, build carbon intensive industries. That's not the point of it, because originally they were supposed to be investing in green technology and the green transition. And so we said, we're not going to do that. We're going to return it to people so that they can make the decisions that they need. But we never really talked about it. We never really explained it in a way that made sense to people. And so
Yeah.
I think that, part of our job as politicians is to, share and communicate the decisions that we're making and why, and to be transparent about that. And it wasn't that we weren't being transparent. I just don't think we told the full story. And I think when you tell the full story, people go, oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense. So, we'll have to see. But for me, I'm not going to abandon the fight against climate change because this is actually the system that makes the most sense. And it is the system that economists say is also the least expensive for consumers.
Okay. Life is full of ironies. Instead of giving the carbon tax revenues to, say, the Ontario government, you gave it to Ontarians, and then they elected uh, the Ford Conservative government, looks like three times running, and he just built the highways anyway. Uh,
Well, he hasn't built any highways yet.
he's, I believe he
They're
sure
tied
hopes he
up
can.
with some pretty serious investigations, I think.
Okay. Um, you also call for cutting the GST by 1 point for 1 year. Um, I guess I've got two questions about that. One is, does the recent GST holiday encourage you about the practical feasibility and the political pop that you would get if you do something smaller for longer?
So, um, I think the GST holiday was a bit confusing for businesses, and it was a lot of administrative work for them for a short period of time. The reason why I'm proposing to cut the GST from 5 to 4% for a year is that is one way where the federal government can give Canadians immediate relief when it comes to the cost of living. And that's on average $750 a year per Canadian. And it's actually something that helps the lowest income and no income Canadians the most, who still have to purchase essentials. And so it is a way to like give a real immediate relief to Canadians. And I'm not doing it as a spur to the economy. It is specifically in a way to provide relief in a way that the federal government can, because there's lots of things that we can't do as a federal government, but this is something we can do immediately that would have a real impact for people.
The second question is a little more philosophical. I got to think that a progressive government would say that if we've got a problem in this country is that there's not nearly enough tax revenue given the ambitions that you obviously have for the role of government, that you can't afford as much government as you want to provide.
So that's why two things I'll say, Paul, in that regard. One is that I'm also proposing a permanent increase to the corporate tax rate for the wealthiest companies in Canada. So those that earn over $500 million a year in profit, from 15 to 17%. That is one way to collect additional revenues and a way for those companies that are earning over $500 million a year in profit to pay their fair share in Canada. And the other thing is, I'm not proposing a middle class tax cut. That is something that is permanent and structural. And quite frankly, we did in 2015 and it didn't really work. And so I'm not going to recycle tired old ideas that, don't have either the political or the economic impact that is, being touted out there. And, if you are earning $80,000 to $111,000 a year, that's not like a crazy income, but you're not going to feel the impact of the middle class tax cut the same way that somebody who is, like lower middle class, lower or no income, is going to feel the GST tax cut. And one of the criticisms that I think is valid for our government is that we've done a lot of things that are targeted, and those targeted things have, been important, like the Canada Child Benefit that is based on income, but we haven't done a lot of things that are universal. And I think that we do need to do a universal tax cut from the 5 to the 4% for GST. It benefits everybody, but it benefits the most vulnerable the most because they spend more of their overall share of income on the GST.
I was struck as I looked through your promises and policies. There's not a lot dealing with international relations. I mean, there's obviously a kind of an overriding concern with our biggest partnership, rivalry with our biggest neighbor, but it's a big world out there. Are you less comfortable on foreign policy questions?
Well, I was the Minister of International Development for 2 years, and I was the chair of the Global Affairs Cabinet Committee. So I'm very comfortable when it comes to foreign affairs. But I think what Canadians are focused on right now and what this election is going to be about is two things. I think it's going to be about the threat from south of the border, and I think it's going to be about cost of living here in Canada. And so my focus for the leadership campaign and for the election is on the things that Canadians are preoccupied with. That doesn't mean that I don't have lots of ideas and lots of comments on world affairs, but I think what everyday Canadians are worried about is how are the threat of tariffs going to affect my livelihood? And do I have a government that knows how to respond to protect me and to make sure that I can make ends meet at the end of the month?
One of the sort of global issues that you do deal with is defense, and you are in favor of getting to 2% of GDP expenditures in defense. But like Chrystia Freeland, you would do it in part by increasing
She
salaries in the
actually
military.
she actually announced that after me. So I was the first person to say that. So Chrystia Freeland, like Karina Gould, would do that by supporting the Canadian Armed Forces.
I have it. I have a hard time believing that Chrystia Freeland is hopping on a bandwagon somewhere. Sorry,
Well, go
that's a
back.
little
Bob Fife asked me about it
that's a little
about
editorial
a week
comment.
before, and I was the first person in this leadership campaign to say that I would get to 2%
Yeah.
NATO spending, and that I would do it by increasing the salaries of the Canadian Armed Forces personnel and by putting forward a procurement czar to get our procurement in order. So, Paul, take my word for it. I was out of the gate way ahead of everybody else.
Well, then, congratulations. You get to be the first person to answer the first question that popped into my head when I saw that policy, which is if we pay every soldier in the armed forces more, that does not increase the number that we can send to Latvia if things get a little dicey over there in Central Europe. I mean, is increasing salaries just the quickest way to getting to 2%?
It is the only way that we will get more people in the military. We do not pay our soldiers the wages that they deserve. When we are in a crisis or in an emergency, our Canadian Armed Forces are there for us. They are there when it's natural disasters. They were there in COVID. They are there standing up for Canada and our allies around the world. We have a recruitment and retention crisis in the Canadian Armed Forces. So the only way that we're going to get more military personnel to Latvia is if we actually pay our soldiers the wages that they deserve, and that we as Canadians should be paying them for the incredible service that they provide us.
Except we've only recruited, as in processed through into active duty, a tiny fraction of the number of people who've already applied over the last several years. We don't have a recruitment crisis. We have a candidate processing crisis, essentially. Yet again, another shortcoming of government capacity rather than of people's interest in getting into the armed forces.
And a retention crisis too, Paul, right? Like we also have a problem retaining people. And part of that is because it's hard right now to live on a calf salary. So we need to make sure that we're paying people fairly. I don't think that should be a contentious issue, but I do hear you on getting people into the Canadian Armed Forces and getting them into active duty. I think that is something that we do need to work on extensively as well. And because I've heard from many people who've applied, they've been waiting in the process, and they're just like, I'm not going to wait 18 months for this, right? Like, I'm going to go do something else. Like, in today's day and age, we have to be quicker and faster when it comes to getting people to work in the government or the public service or the Canadian Armed Forces if we're going to be able to retain them.
I have to say, it's kind of refreshing to talk to someone who's been in the government for the last several years, who acknowledges something I've said and says they've heard it. If there's a knock against this government, it's that it has seemed chronically, wall to wall, just incapable of processing inputs, of hearing people when they talk. Do you have any first of all, do you acknowledge the problem? And secondly, do you have any structural responses to that problem?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, I mean, that's why I started off by saying that, we have to re-earn Canadians' trust. I think the big thing is people are saying, like, are you listening? And I think that's one of the reasons that propelled us into government in 2015 in a majority, because we were responding to what Canadians were asking for at the time. Now, as you are in government, you get governmentitis and you sometimes get further away from people. That's to me not the right approach. We have to make sure that we are continuously engaging with Canadians and hearing what matters to them at that point in time. I was reflecting a little bit over the past couple of weeks in terms of what I would do differently. And, you know, I think sometimes we just sounded too defensive. We were too defensive in what we were doing and how we were doing it, as opposed to engaging in a more open dialogue and conversation about, well, maybe we didn't get that right, and here's how we can listen to the feedback, incorporate it, and deliver what people are telling us isn't working. And that's always been my approach. I mean, my approach has always been to be open to listen to feedback and try to make those changes. Now, we're all human, nobody is perfect. So, I can't say that I'm going to get it right 100% of the time, but that's also what I think is part of the dialogue of democracy, is to say, yeah, maybe we didn't get this part right. How can we fix that? And how can we change so that we get it right in the future?
Well, I think we've made a good down payment on this kind of conversations that we need to have. You've been generous with your time. Karina Gould, thanks for joining me today, and good luck during the debates.
Thank you, Paul.